if you really want to live optimally, you must be informed. You must live with intention. The very sad reality of our current existence as humans is that if we just eat like everyone else eats, live like everyone else lives, and don't think about how we're moving through the world, what pesticides, what toxins we might come in contact with, what the pros and cons of certain foods may be, what the pros and cons of living in certain areas may be, what the pros and cons of sleeping on a Wi-Fi router may be, or being exposed to toxins if you live next to a coal-fired power plant, or what's in your drinking water. If you just live your life without attention to those things, I think that many of us will suffer unnecessarily. So the work I do is not about being afraid of everything. It's about helping all of you live with intention and have the knowledge, which is indeed powerful, to remove those toxins and I would say negative inputs from your life. Some of the things I talk about are more controversial than others. Glyphosate is something that I think many people are concerned about, but many people also are great fans of vegetables. I'm a fan of neither. I feel great and my autoimmune disease is getting better. Check out this review on beef organs from Frank G. The supplements are great. I ditched my multivitamin and strictly take bone marrow and liver and beef organs, along with consuming a mostly animal-based diet. I do cheat with alcohol and random food on the weekends typically. But even with that, my energy has been crazy good and sustained all day long. I feel great, as well as improved mental clarity, better mood. I also have vitiligo. I've had white spots scattered across my body since I was about 14 years old. Some newer, bigger spots, e.g. my armpits, are completely pigmentless, have appeared over the last few years. I'm 31 now. And I don't want to jinx it, and I don't know if it's a coincidence, but some of my normal pigment is for sure returning to my armpits and filling in the paleness. I took pictures about 3 weeks ago, plan on comparing future pictures to track progress alongside of animal-based eating and the supplements. Hell yeah. Hell yeah, right back to you, Frank. I'm super excited for you. We've seen this very often with animal-based diets. Joe Rogan has talked about his vitiligo getting better when he's done carnivore. And I think even on animal-based, his vitiligo is getting better. So this is what's so cool for me about this way of eating that I'm excited to talk about in my podcast alongside Heart and Soil Supplements, that organs, meat, fruit, honey, and raw dairy, I strongly believe are the most sought after foods for humans. If you need fresh organs in your life, get them. If you want desiccated organs because you can't get fresh organs, we've got you covered at Heart and Soil. And it's amazing what happens with autoimmunity and chronic illness in general when we eat in this way. To get some desiccated organs, check us out at heartandsoil.co. That's .co. Our mission is to help you reclaim your birthright to optimal and fully radical health, just like Frank G is doing. On this week's podcast, I wanted to dive deeper into the rabbit hole of glyphosate. I did a little bit about glyphosate in an Ask Me Anything episode a few weeks ago. Got a lot of questions about that. There's been a lot of talk about glyphosate again on social media recently. So I wanted to go down this rabbit hole, see what I could find in terms of studies, see what was interesting as I dove deeper. And I found a lot of really interesting stuff. For instance, the fact that when you look at the way that pesticides affect humans and cell lines and animal models, one in isolation is not the same as many together. 2 + 2 = 5, if you will. So enjoy this podcast on glyphosate. I also get into discussions of PFASs, so perfluoroalkylated substances. I talk about kale, and yet another reason why you may not want to eat kale, like thallium, the fact that these leafy greens appear to pull metals from the dirt. And I will talk about genistein and a new study showing that it is harmful for males, whereas genistein found soy and beans. Yet another reason to not eat those things in your diet. This is why I'm such a fan of an animal-based diet, guys. So enjoy this podcast on glyphosate and all of the meanderings that I take from there. Also want to give you guys a heads up that Animal-Based Gathering is happening 2023 in Costa Rica. You can go to animalbasedgathering.com to sign up, to check out details. We have a nonprofit now, the Animal-Based Nutrition Research Foundation, the abnrf.org. We're working on getting some studies together with my buddy Stefan Van Vliet and maybe possibly my friend Tommy Wood, who's going to be on the podcast soon. You can go to abnrf.org to see what we're up to. And hopefully we're going to start moving the needle in the right direction with regard to research in the medical sphere. But if you want to meet a bunch of people that are into this animal-based lifestyle, check us out at animalbasedgathering.com. Join us for the gathering in Costa Rica in 2023. It's going to be an amazing one. We've done 2 already, and over 100 people have come to both. It's been a really cool gathering in terms of community and whatnot. All right, my friends, love you all. On to the podcast. There has been a ton of talk recently about glyphosate, pesticides in general, but especially glyphosate, the active ingredient in RoundUp. in the media recently because of an article that came out. Joe Rogan reposted something talking about the fact that glyphosate was found in the majority of urine samples that were tested in humans. This isn't that surprising when you think about where glyphosate actually is. It's in our food supply for sure. But I thought it would be interesting to do a deeper dive on glyphosate and other pesticides this week. And then as you will see, this will then dovetail into discussions of kale, other pesticides like Dacthal, PFAS, something I've talked about in the past, perfluoroalkylated substances, PFOSs, and then we'll go down the rabbit hole even further to Thallium. But we will end up in a space where I think we will be a little bit skeptical, in fact, a lot skeptical about glyphosate. At least that's where I am at this point. And obviously work hard to avoid that in our foods. And also be very skeptical of leafy greens based on the way that they may accumulate heavy metals, and be aware of perfluoroalkylated substances, PFASs, and where they are found in our food supply, how to avoid those. It strikes me at the beginning of this podcast that this is a little bit of a doom and gloom podcast. Some podcasts, a lot of what I do is about telling you guys things I think that we might want to avoid to be healthy. So I just want to make it clear that many of you listening to this are already doing a lot of really great things. This isn't meant to be doom and gloom. This isn't meant to be unattainable information. This isn't meant to be an illustration, or hopefully it's not an illustration of the fact that I'm afraid of everything. This is meant to be me sharing information that I have gleaned with you in hopes that you may use it in your life to live a better life. Recently on Instagram, I did a post, am I afraid of everything? And the takeaway message there was that I don't believe I'm afraid of everything. I believe that in 2022, and probably even for the last number of decades leading up to this point, if you really want to live optimally, you must be informed. You must live with intention. The very sad reality of our current existence as humans is that if we just eat like everyone else eats, live like everyone else lives, and don't think about how we're moving through the world, what pesticides, what toxins we might come in contact with, what the pros and cons of certain foods may be, what the pros and cons of living in certain areas may be, what the pros and cons of sleeping on a Wi-Fi router may be, or being exposed to toxins if you live next to a coal-fired power plant, or what's in your drinking water. If you just live your life without attention to those things, I think that many of us will suffer unnecessarily. So the work I do is not about being afraid of everything. It's about helping all of you live with intention and have the knowledge, which is indeed powerful, to remove those toxins and I would say negative inputs from your life. Some of the things I talk about are more controversial than others. Glyphosate is something that I think many people are concerned about, but many people also are great fans of vegetables. I'm a fan of neither. So let's begin this podcast talking about glyphosate. And as I said, we will journey to many interesting realms over the course of our time together. The first thing that I wanted to share is that, as you can see here, in July of 2017, glyphosate was listed as a substance known to the state of California to cause cancer. And previously, I believe in 2015, the IARC, the International Association of Research on Cancer, WHO subcommittee, also listed glyphosate as a group 2 carcinogen. I believe that's their classification. It's interesting to note that group 2 also includes things like red meat, something I've talked about in the past, and acrylamide, something I've spoken about that I'm not a fan of, that's found in processed and cooked breads. When you brown the bread, you get acrylamide. But some things that are considered to be class 2 carcinogens, I would debate. Based on the research I've seen, and as I'll talk about in this podcast, I think that the jury is still out on glyphosate and cancer, but it doesn't look like glyphosate is good for humans in any way, shape, or form. In the wake of these decisions, General Mills has been hit with a number of lawsuits. So this is 2018. General Mills was hit with a lawsuit over glyphosate containing Cheerios, which I think is kind of hilarious. The fact that Cheerios, this cereal that I grew up eating, especially Honey Nut Cheerios, is now the subject of lawsuits suggesting that it contains a probable human carcinogen by the WHO in California. I'm not thinking that Cheerios are any good for humans at all. And as you'll see, the Environmental Working Group has done numerous studies on Cheerios, other breakfast cereals, oats, and wheat-containing crackers that show there is a significant amount of glyphosate in those products. What is a significant amount of glyphosate? We'll get to that in a moment. U.S. News and World Report, Cheerios, cancer-causing ingredient in weed killer. found in Cheerios. No shit, of course. I mean, it's on almost all oats. Why would it not be in Cheerios? General Mills has also been sued over glyphosate in Nature Valley products. This is in 2016, probably after the IARC ruling in 2015. Nonprofits filed a lawsuit against General Mills saying the company misled the public with a natural claim on its Nature Valley granola bars. The granola bar label reads, made with 100% natural whole grain oats. The product contains glyphosate, a chemical found in herbicides like RoundUp. Glyphosate comes from the farming and production of oats, the product's major ingredient. I'm not sure what the outcome of this lawsuit was, but at least there is some legal action being taken against these companies because glyphosate is in a lot of the foods you eat. If you are eating grains, even many of the foods that you wouldn't expect it to be in. I'll get into that in one moment. This is quite interesting. This is a glyphosate use map in the United States. This is from 2017, so it's a little bit outdated. This is obviously taking place in 2022, but this is the most recent one that I could find. It's from the USGS, the United States Geological Survey. And whenever I used to look at these maps, I always put myself, wherever I was living, on the map and thought, how contaminated is the area around me for glyphosate? But what I should have also been doing was thinking, how contaminated is the area where my meat or fruit or honey is being produced for glyphosate? So I used to live in Austin, Texas. Where I live now is not on this map because mostly I spend my time in Central America and Costa Rica for a variety of reasons that I've discussed previously. But if you put Austin on this map, Austin certainly has some glyphosate surrounding it, though perhaps not as much as the northern middle of the country or the eastern seaboard or the Central Valley of California, parts of Oregon and Washington up here. I went to medical school in Arizona. There's definitely some glyphosate exposure down in the around Yuma, but where I was in Tucson, maybe a little bit, but not as much. Phoenix, maybe not so much in Arizona. Parts of the desert Southwest look to be fairly free from that because there's no water there. You can't grow anything anyway. But where I went to residency up in Seattle, certainly there is some, and in parts of Eastern Washington. So where you live may be something to consider because your drinking water will almost certainly be contaminated by glyphosate. If you are anywhere in this central part of the country or anywhere basically east of Denver, Colorado, west of Denver, there are some areas that are okay, but still glyphosate use in the west. But then where is your meat grown and raised? And has your meat been tested for glyphosate? Something to consider. And then where is your honey? Where's your fruit coming from? There's cross-contamination. Obviously, organic will be best, but that's important to consider. As I was doing this research for the podcast, I came across the average use of pesticides per area of cropland. And unfortunately, Costa Rica is one of the worst in the world, which makes it even more important for me to look for organic food here in Costa Rica. So use of herbicide glyphosate in Costa Rica, 2007 to 2015. I won't bore you with the details other than to say that the numbers are not good. There is quite a bit of glyphosate used in Costa Rica right now, but its use has been banned in natural areas and preserves. So where I live now in Costa Rica isn't around farmland, but on the farmland that there is in Costa Rica, there's a lot of glyphosate here, unfortunately. Maybe we can change that at some point in the future. I think it's also interesting then to look at some of the studies that have been done by the Environmental Working Group, who tested a number of kids' cereals and foods for glyphosate. So this is a post from ewg.org. I appreciate a lot of their stuff. You should check them out. They say findings released as major scientific study shows eating organic lowers cancer risk. That indeed is true. I'll show you that study in a moment. And you can see here they tested 28 samples. There was glyphosate in 28 of them, and there were 26 of the 28 that had levels of glyphosate above the Environmental Working Group's benchmark for glyphosate, which is 160 parts per billion. Now, it's important to note that the EPA legal limit for glyphosate in oats is 30 parts per million, which is much higher than 160 parts per billion. But the Environmental Working Group bases their benchmark of 160 parts per billion on some studies that have been done in animals. I think that it's unclear right now what the levels of glyphosate we should place. It's unclear right now what level of glyphosate is certainly going to be harmful for humans. And these benchmarks for levels of glyphosate are really just up in the air. Nobody really knows, but the EWG benchmark is 160 parts per billion. That is not necessarily the level that is set throughout the scientific research. But this is quite interesting. Glyphosate in all Cheerios, no surprise, Quaker Oats, and many other cereals sampled. So you can see Quaker granola, you can see the levels here in parts per billion, 600, 800. Some instant oats, overnight oats from Quaker had over 1,000 or 1,800 parts per billion. Oats breakfast cereal, Quaker oatmeal squares, brown sugar, had 2,746 parts per billion. Oats breakfast cereal, Quaker oats squares, and honey. Sounds like something I would have liked as a kid, 2,837. This is just to say that all of these breakfast cereals that contained oats, a very common ingredient, a very common grain that is sprayed by glyphosate during the production and also at the harvest, they are very contaminated with glyphosate, or at least there are levels that are much above what the EWG thinks are appropriate for humans in these studies. So you can look at these charts and see them in full, the complete results of the 2018 glyphosate tests. If your kids are eating these things or you are eating these things, I would suggest thinking about the levels of glyphosate that you believe that may be appropriate for you and your family. I would try and avoid it altogether, but these are the cereals that I grew up on. It's kind of scary to think about how much I ingested. Fruity Cheerios, Frosted Cheerios, Chocolate Cheerios. I didn't know there were so many types of Cheerios. This is crazy. Cheerios Oat Crunch Cinnamon, Apple Cinnamon Cheerios, Barbaros Multigrain Spoonfuls. All of these were tested. All of them had some levels of glyphosate. Again, the Quaker Oatmeal Squares, Honey Nut, 3,000 almost parts per billion of 3,000 parts per billion, almost 3,000 parts per billion of glyphosate. Interestingly, Kashi Heart to Heart Organic Honey Toasted had no detectable levels of glyphosate. That's encouraging. At least some organic foods that are oat-based didn't have levels of glyphosate. And indeed, some organic oats in this trial did not have levels of glyphosate that were detected. You can see down here, there are the 365, which is the Whole Foods brand, old-fashioned organic rolled oats had no detectable levels of glyphosate. Bob's Red Mill Organic had no detection in one, and 10 and 20 in another. Some that were organic did have glyphosate at lower levels. Nature's Path Organic Old-Fashioned Organic Oats had some. But as you can see, most of the cereals that were not organic had significant levels of glyphosate in them that we should be aware of and make a decision for ourselves based on what we believe to be an appropriate or a reasonable level of glyphosate in our foods. Anyone who's listened to any of my podcasts in the past knows that I don't think oats are a good food for humans in general, nor do I think wheat is a good food for humans. These are both grains. Grains are seeds. Oats are full of phytic acid. Oats are full of digestive enzyme inhibitors. Oats are full of all kinds of things that I don't think are great for you. A lot of you may be eating oatmeal and hearing me say this for the first time, but this should come as no surprise, really. I don't think oats are optimal food for humans. There are many better sources of carbohydrates for humans in the human diet. In fact, I can't think of anything you would want to get from oats that you couldn't get from organs, meat, fruit, honey, or raw dairy. That's why I think an animal-based diet is really the optimal diet for humans. It's both the least toxic and the most nutrient-rich and bioavailable as far as I can reason at this point in my research meanderings. But I've eaten oatmeal in the past. When I was in college, I ate a shitload of oatmeal. Incidentally, I also developed multiple stress fractures in my legs, running a lot. That is my N of 1 for how bad the phytic acid in oats can be and how it can rob you of minerals, nutrients, and bone density. There certainly may have been other deficiencies in my diet that contributed to multiple stress fractures, but I was eating a shitload of oats with a lot of milk. And so by all accounts, I should have had plenty of calcium and a decent amount of protein in my diet. I certainly may not have had enough vitamin K2, but milk should have some of that at least. And I had pretty serious stress fractures. I actually got a stress fracture in my left femur in college. It was quite a stressful thing. There was a bone scan, concerns about cancer. Why does a 19-year-old have a stress fracture in his femur? Well, maybe it's because he's running 60 miles a week, training for 5Ks or 10Ks, and he's eating just oats all the time because he's a college student and it's easy. And I was eating a ton of foods that were phytic acid rich. So that's my anecdotal experience. Incidentally, I had multiple stress fractures throughout my not very illustrious running career. Mostly I ran ultras for those who are interested. After I realized I was not anywhere near fast enough to be running short races, I went to longer races, which didn't do much for me in the long run other than occasionally give me March hematuria, which is when you pee out blood because you've run so far. I thought it was cool at the time, but it wasn't. I think my running accolades included maybe 1 or 2 50K wins and a couple of 50-mile finishes. But I only say that to mention that I did run distance races in the past of over 50 miles and had many stress fractures in the training for that, which seemed to get better. I had no stress fractures in my running training when I eliminated grains from my diet and went to a Paleolithic diet. So again, that's just my N of 1, but phytic acid appeared to have been a major problem for me. I'm not a fan of oats or wheat or any of those grains. That's for another podcast. But obviously, all of these grains are heavily sprayed with glyphosate. Glyphosate can also be found in things like beer and wine. Here is a Cowperg Education Fund experiment. I'm not exactly sure what Cowperg is, some sort of nonprofit group. But you can see here that if they look at beer and wine, they find significant levels of RoundUp and the active ingredient glyphosate in all of those. They had, of the 20 samples, 19 contained glyphosate. The highest level of glyphosate was found in Sutter Home wine at 51 parts per billion. So less than what we see in most cereals, but still there. 3 of the 4 organic beer and wine contained glyphosate. Glyphosate is not allowed or used in organic farming. Several types of organic products were contaminated. Sam Smith Organic, Inkari Estate Organic Wine, large conventional brands such as Coors, Tsingtao, and Miller Lite showed glyphosate levels above 25 parts per billion. One brand, Peak Beer, did not contain detectable levels of glyphosate. So you can read this online if you are interested in the levels of glyphosate in beer and wine. This is just to say that glyphosate is present in many foods, obviously, and even beer and wine. So yet another reason to be careful about what you are eating. So at this point, let's talk about some of the science behind glyphosate, science that says it's not a problem, science that says it is a problem, and what we can say at this point. The overarching narrative here is that the science is complicated. We have to look at dosing, whether humans could reasonably get these doses in our lifetimes. And as you will see, we also must look at adjuvants. These are additives to formulations like RoundUp, which, as you will see, appear to make the sum formula of those pesticides plus adjuvants look more harmful than single ingredients like glyphosate. And we also need to understand that glyphosate is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to pesticides. There are others like Dactyl, there are others like 2,4-D, and what are the additive effects of all of these in humans? I think most people listening to this will understand that pesticides are probably not a good thing for humans at all. If you could avoid these, why wouldn't you? Unless you really thought they were not bad for humans at all. But if there was a shred of evidence that they were harmful in any way, shape, or form, I think most of us would avoid these. It's also worth pointing out at this moment that there is a really interesting paper I've spoken about many times in the past from Bruce Ames. And the title of that paper is Dietary Pesticides, 99.9% All Natural. Now, granted, this paper was written in the 1980s before glyphosate was used widely in the food supply. But the point he is making in that paper is that the majority of the, quote, pesticides that we consume in our diets are actually from the plants themselves. And perhaps we shouldn't worry about pesticides on food if 99.9% of the pesticides are in the plants we are eating. Well, I look at that a little differently and think we should probably worry about the pesticides we're spraying on the plants. Yes, because we don't really know what those do in humans. And if we could avoid using them, we should. We should minimize our exposure as much as possible, but we should also not ignore the fact that there are massive amounts of pesticides made by plants that are there to discourage the consumption of the vegetable parts of plants. This is the reason that I do what I do, you guys, to let people know about the fact that vegetables may not be great for humans after all. I'll show you the paper here from Bruce Ames. Dietary pesticides, 99.9% all natural. We estimate that Americans eat 1.5 grams of natural pesticides per person per day, about 10,000 times more than they eat of synthetic pesticide residues. Now, all of these are not created equally. Perhaps we have some ability to detoxify these plant pesticides. I would say that plant pesticides probably have a longer history within human biology, and we can deal with some of them. I don't think plant pesticides are great for humans, or synthetic pesticides should be a part of our diet in any significant amount. But it is interesting to note that when we're talking about pesticides, plants make a lot of their own in addition to what is sprayed on plants. Here's an interesting chart that I've talked about many times. 49 natural pesticides and metabolites found in cabbage. I mean, these names are the types of things you wouldn't want to read out loud because you will all certainly go to sleep. This will be hypnotic. You will crash your cars, and I don't want to be responsible for that. I'll just read one or two. Glucosinolates, 2-propenyl glucosinolate, 3-methylthiopropyl glucosinolate. You get the idea. The list goes on and on. There's 39, there's 49 of them just in cabbage that we've studied. Bruce Ames goes on in this paper to talk about the fact that very few of these has actually been studied in humans, and we don't really know what most of the pesticides in plants do in human biology. That is not the subject of this podcast, which is talking about the pesticides that are sprayed on plants, but it does harken back to major, broader themes I have discussed in the past, that many of the pesticides, the plant defense chemicals in plants, have not been adequately or even significantly studied in humans, and we don't really know what they do on humans long term. It's also, therefore, very interesting when we see anecdotes of people who get rid of vegetables, admittedly, along with other things, and see improvements in their autoimmune symptoms. So the hypothesis that arises from that is, are there some people in who vegetables may trigger autoimmunity? That's an interesting sort of idea that I've come across in this research about optimal diets for humans. Again, not the topic of today's podcast, but something to understand that is an overarching interest of mine, overarching theme in the work that I do. I mentioned this study earlier on in the podcast, the association of frequent organic food consumption with cancer risk. This is a December 2018 study, the findings from the Nutrinet Sante prospective cohort study. And the takeaways are not surprising. A higher frequency of organic food consumption was associated with a reduced risk of cancer. But what we must remember here is that this is epidemiology. And like all epidemiology, like all observational studies, we must be cautious of healthy user bias and unhealthy user bias. This is exactly the type of study that I think could be highly confounded by healthy user bias. We can't know if organic food is better for humans until we do an interventional study. Now, what type of healthy user bias could be found in this study? Oh, I don't know. People that eat organic food are probably likely to do other healthy behaviors. So a lot of people have talked about studies like this, the epidemiology of organic food and healthy behaviors, or at least better outcomes for these people, lower rates of cancer. But we really can't draw causative inference here. We don't know that non-organic food is causing cancer. We don't know that organic food is actually lowering the rates of cancer. What we know is that people who eat more organic food tend to have lower rates of cancer. Why is this? We're not really sure. It could be a lot of things. We have to test the individual pieces. The problem in nutritional science is it's difficult to test the individual pieces. But I wanted to point out that study and reiterate the importance of considering the role of healthy user bias in these studies and why it sometimes can make them confounded and not as accurate, or at least not as valuable or strong a platform from which to draw a causative inference as we might hope they were. So let's talk about some science looking at glyphosate and Roundup and whether it is harmful or benign for humans, and go from there. So the first thing I want to point out is that this article really grabbed my attention when I was researching for this podcast. The title is "Major Pesticides Are More Toxic to Human Cells Than Their Declared Active Principles," meaning their component chemicals in individual nature. So they go on to say that many pesticide formulations contain adjuvants. They're often kept confidential. They're called inerts by the manufacturing company. And the declared active principle, of which glyphosate is found in Roundup, is often tested alone. But they did something interesting. They tested the toxicity of 9 pesticides, comparing the active principles and their formulations on 3 human cell lines, which are not important: Hep G2, HEC 293, and JEG3. Glyphosate and a number of other active principles, which are not worth pronouncing, along with their total formulations. They looked at mitochondrial activities, membrane degradation, so cell membrane breakdown, and caspases 3/7 activities, which are part of the cell death cascade. They say that fungicides, which are the chemicals used against fungus, were the most toxic from concentrations 300 to 600 times lower than agricultural dilutions. Okay. So fungicides are really bad. You don't want to be in contact with those, followed by herbicides and then insecticides with very similar profiles in all cell types. Now, this is what's really cool, or at least interesting. Despite its relatively benign reputation, Roundup, with the active ingredient glyphosate, was among the most toxic herbicides and insecticides tested. More importantly, 8 formulations out of 9 were up to 1,000 times more toxic than their active principles. So what they're saying is that if you compare glyphosate, the active ingredient, the active principle in Roundup, to Roundup as a formulation which contains these adjuvants, many of which we actually know, and I'll talk about in a moment, 8 of the 9 formulations were much more toxic than their active principles. So when we're looking at research on glyphosate in isolation, is this appropriate? Should we actually be looking at research on Roundup? Because that is what is sprayed on crops, not glyphosate. And I think we should be. These begin to call into question the validity of a lot of research on glyphosate and whether, we don't know the answer to this, but whether using formulations that are complete would yield different results. Our results challenge the relevance of the acceptable daily intake of pesticides because this norm is calculated from the toxicity of the active principle alone. Chronic tests on pesticides may not reflect relevant environmental exposures if only one ingredient of these mixtures is tested alone. So this is a really important study finding to keep in mind and to use as a framing for all of the future discussions about these things. I will try and note in these discussions which of these are on the active principle or which of these are on the formulation, but much of the research that we will talk about is actually on glyphosate itself and not on the full formulation. So important to understand. In case you didn't think that you were exposed to glyphosate, I would point your attention to this study, the detection of glyphosate residues in animals and humans, and understand that when you look at humans in general, the vast majority of us are full of glyphosate. Unfortunately, even me living here in Costa Rica, trying to eat as much organic food as possible, I'm sure my glyphosate test would be positive. What level they would be, I'm not sure. In fact, I'd like to get it tested in the future, but glyphosate levels can be tested. I'll show you guys in a moment how to do that. But most humans have a significant amount of glyphosate in their urine, in their blood. What is the significant amount of glyphosate? What levels should we be looking at? This is the type of thing that we must understand and clarify. Now, I also wanted to point out that cows kept in genetically modified free areas had significantly lower glyphosate concentrations in urine than conventional husbandry cows. I've spoken about this point many times, but I will reiterate it now. I am not a fan of grain-finished conventional beef. Glyphosate contamination is only one of the reasons. If you compare the nutritional quality or the nutritional contents of grain-finished versus grass-finished beef, you will find that they're pretty similar. But you must look further, in my opinion, to see that grass-finished beef should be lower in things like glyphosate, should be lower in things like PFASs, perfluoroalkylated substances, should be lower in microplastics because of the fact that the cows should be getting better feed. Cows kept in areas free of GMO grains, free of GMO corn, free of GMO grasses, should have lower levels of glyphosate. So when you are eating meat, it's important to understand, is that cow fed hay? Is the cow fed grass where it's growing? Is the cow fed GMO hay? Is the cow fed genetically modified or Roundup sprayed grasses throughout the season? So it's difficult. This is where I said earlier in the podcast, this is not meant to be, am I afraid of everything? This is meant to empower you, to help you understand that the quality of your food must be assayed in an intentional manner. You have to understand what farmers are feeding their cows, where the cows are grown, and then you'll have a sense of how good that meat may be. So here in Costa Rica, I must ask the farm that I get my grass-fed meat from, what are you feeding them? Are they getting fresh grasses? Are you giving them hay? What is the hay sprayed with? This is actually where the term organic grass-fed comes from and may be useful. A cow that's organic grass-fed should not be able to be given anything GMO, anything that is grass that has been sprayed with glyphosate. So the hope is that grass-fed cattle will have less exposure to many of these harmful chemicals. And I think generally that is safe, but it must be validated and corroborated individually. So in terms of research regarding glyphosate, it's really too deep a rabbit hole to go down individually, but I will share a few reviews so you guys can individually go down the rabbit holes if you would like. The first is the effects of glyphosate and Roundup trademark. That's the formulation versus the active principle on the mammalian nervous system. So what is it doing to the nervous system? This is a review. They say the weight of the evidence indicates that in addition to cancer and reproductive effects, Glyphosate and Roundup have significant adverse effects on the brain and behavior and increase the risk of at least some serious neurological diseases. Again, they are looking at all of the human studies. They are looking at individual animal studies. And it's important to understand that a lot of the doses used in the animal studies are higher than what most humans would ever be exposed to in their lives. But it also suggests that this pesticide has the potential to do this. Now, what about in connection with other pesticides? What about in connection with adjuvants? What about a formulation? There are many questions that remain, but I think that the majority of the research that I am looking at is suggesting that there is at least some signal that glyphosate is harmful to humans. And I think we would all do well to avoid it as much as possible. Earlier in the abstract, I will read, they say we have reviewed reports on the effects of glyphosate and Roundup on the mammalian nervous system function. As with several other herbicides, Roundup exposure has been associated with an increased risk of Parkinson's disease, death of neurons in the substantia nigra. That is a region of the brain where movement is controlled. Dopaminergic neurons, that region of the brain is damaged in Parkinson's disease. There is also some evidence implicating Roundup in an elevated risk of autism. That's a very controversial topic. Other studies have shown effects of Roundup on synaptic transmission, that is transmission between neurons, in animal and cellular studies. The major mechanism of action appears to be oxidative stress accompanied by mitochondrial dysfunction. That is not something you want. You do not want those two things in excess. Some gut bacteria utilize the enzyme used by plants that is part of the shikimate pathway, a folate pathway. Glyphosate is known to inhibit that. So there is a growing body of literature also suggesting that glyphosate in our food supply may disrupt our gut microbiome. There is a growing body of literature to suggest that the use of glyphosate in our food supply may also be damaging and disruptive to our gut microbiome. That should come as no surprise because, as these authors are pointing out, this shikimate pathway, which is a folate-producing pathway in plants, is shared by many bacteria. And though the glyphosate may not actually be doing anything in your cells, although there's apparent evidence that it does do things directly in human cells or cell lines, it certainly may be interacting with your gut flora in a potentially negative way. There is a large and growing body of evidence that the gut microbiome alters susceptibility to a great number of human diseases, including nervous system function. The weight of the evidence indicates that in addition to cancer, reproductive effects, the effects of glyphosate have significant adverse effects on the brain and behavior of humans. So that's something I read before. So while we're talking about neurologic effects of this, I wanted to share a case report of Parkinsonism after a glycine derivative exposure. This is from 2001. That first article was from 2022, so it was a very recent review. I think that the research on glyphosate has advanced a lot in the last 20 years, so it's important to know when you're looking at the article being published. But this is a case report from 2001. A 54-year-old man accidentally sprayed himself with the chemical agent glyphosate, probably as Roundup. He developed disseminated skin lesions 6 hours after the accident. That sounds bad. A month later, he developed symmetrical Parkinsonian syndrome. 2 years after the initial exposure to glyphosate, MRI imaging revealed hyperintense signal in the globus pallidus and substantia nigra. Again, the substantia nigra is one of the regions involved in the movement control in the human brain, globus pallidus as well. Bilaterally on T2 weighted images, it was treated with levodopa and another drug for Parkinson's and provided satisfactory clinical outcome. Now, the chances that an otherwise healthy 54-year-old man would develop a symmetrical Parkinsonian syndrome related to something other than glyphosate after an intense exposure which caused disseminated skin lesions, those chances are very low. Clinically, what we usually see in Parkinsonian syndromes that do not have a known cause is that one side is worse than the other at the original presentation. It is not a symmetrical Parkinsonian syndrome. So to develop a symmetrical Parkinsonian syndrome is clinically abnormal, especially for a 54-year-old. I think we cannot say for sure, but in this case, signs point to the possibility, the strong possibility, that this 54-year-old man's Parkinsonian syndrome, symmetrical 1 month after an intense exposure to glyphosate, was probably related to that exposure to glyphosate. Here is a study looking at thyroid cancer and pesticide use in a central California agricultural area. This is a case control study. Again, this is epidemiology. It is from 2022, so it is more recent. The study provides the first evidence to support the hypothesis that residential pesticide exposure from agricultural applications is associated with an increased risk of thyroid cancer. This is all pesticides, but glyphosate is in there with an odds ratio of 1.33 and a confidence interval of 1.12 to 1.58. Although there are other pesticides that are used here, paraquat, oxyfluorophene. Risk of thyroid cancer increased proportionally to the total number of pesticides subjects were exposed to 20 years before the diagnosis or interview. In all models, paraquat dichloride was associated with thyroid cancer. So as we've seen before, the number of exposures to different pesticides was important, and the number of pesticides that were exposed is important. They may be additive as we're exposed to multiple pesticides. So simply studying glyphosate in isolation and certainly not studying glyphosate without its active ingredients, and not studying glyphosate without the full formulation and the adjuvants is a mistake in terms of our consideration of pesticides. But that is a striking study from 2022. Interesting story. When I was in Costa Rica, perhaps 25 years ago, as a junior, sophomore in college, I lived on the east coast of Costa Rica in a town called Limon, and I worked in a hospital there in my pre-medical studies in college. And we would often see people who were poisoned with paraquat dichloride, paraquat being a common pesticide applied to bananas. And that eastern part of the country near Limon is a big banana farming area. I didn't know it at the time, nor was I concerned about it. The bliss, more likely ignorance of youth, but I was living in an area that was literally surrounded with banana plantations, and patients would come into the emergency room poisoned with paraquat or who had purposefully swallowed paraquat in a suicidal gesture, perhaps indicating the quality of life for some of the workers there, which is not so good. So I've had direct experience with paraquat in a clinical setting in the past. You don't hear about that one much in the United States right now. Moving on in terms of studies that I think are interesting in terms of glyphosate. Here is one. Glyphosate infiltrates the brain and increases pro-inflammatory cytokine TNF-alpha, implications for neurodegenerative disorders. This is a 2022 study, and this is a mouse model. So the analysis revealed that glyphosate infiltrated the brain in a dose-dependent manner, upregulated TNF-alpha in both plasma and brain tissue post-exposure. Now, these doses of glyphosate are massive, 125, 250, or 500 milligrams per kilogram per day of glyphosate. No one is getting that much glyphosate in the United States unless they are literally drinking it or being exposed to it when they are spraying it on plants. So I guess I should amend that statement. Unless you are someone that works in a field spraying glyphosate, I do not think you're going to get this much exposure to glyphosate. So these are big doses of glyphosate, but in mice, they look pretty bad. Collectively, these results show for the first time glyphosate infiltrates the brain. That's not surprising considering the other studies we've seen suggesting neurological damage, elevates both the expression of TNF-alpha and soluble amyloid beta. Not a good thing. Certainly, that is a marker of neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's. Disrupts the transcriptome, that is the set of genes being transcribed, and proteins that are made from those genes in a dose-dependent manner, suggesting that exposure to this herbicide may have detrimental outcomes regarding the health of the general population. Yeah, I think that's reasonable to say, but we don't exactly know what the level is that is harmful for humans. So if we go to this review, this is a really good one. The impact and toxicity of glyphosate and glyphosate-based herbicides on health and immunity. This is from 2020. Their conclusion, even as many outcomes are still being debated, evidence points to a need for more studies to better decipher the risks from glyphosate and better regulation of its global utilization. Glyphosate effects on the immune system appear to alter the complement cascade, not good, phagocytic function, lymphocyte responses, increase the production of pro-inflammatory cytokines in fish. In mammals, including humans, glyphosate mainly has cytotoxic, cell-killing, and genotoxic effects, causing inflammation, affecting lymphocyte, that is a immune cell function, and the interactions between microorganisms and the immune system, perhaps throughout the body, but also in the gut. So this is a very detailed paper, which will provide many references for those really interested in going down the rabbit hole. I highlighted a few here. Testosterone production also reduced in male offspring of rats exposed to non-toxic doses of glyphosate. The endocrine disruption altered reproductive behavior with modifications of sexual preference and a delay in the first mount of females to initiate reproduction. RoundUp, trademark, could also reduce progesterone production in human placental cells, but only at higher concentrations than ones causing cell death, suggesting the effect of progesterone is probably related to the cytotoxicity. So you can keep going. Human pregnancies were also affected by glyphosate-based herbicides. as a shown correlation between glyphosate-based herbicides exposure and higher frequency of miscarriages, preterm births, et cetera, et cetera. Teratogenicity, which is birth defects from glyphosate-based herbicides, have been shown on fish, cardiac defects, as well as in rats, mice, and chickens. Not good. We can talk about neurologic effects. Besides their unconventional use for suicidal purposes, a correlation between exposure to organophosphate pesticides and suicide rates has been suspected. Anxiety behaviors were observed in mice exposed intranasally to low doses of Gifligolex, which is probably a pesticide. This author showed that mouse chronic 12 weeks and even subchronic exposure, oral exposures of Roundup caused anxiety and depression-like behaviors. For instance, decreased grooming time or increased immobility in open field experiments. So this is the problem in our society today, is that women and perhaps men are being exposed to too much glyphosate, and that means that they're spending too much time in front of the mirror grooming. This is why women won't leave the house and they can't be on time. This is obviously a joke. I'm being facetious and humorous now, but I do think that there's interesting evidence here, and who knows how this is affecting us as humans. The impact of glyphosate and glyphosate-based herbicides on the liver is of great interest. Pathologies ranging from mild liver lesions to fibrosis were observed in rainbow trout. Likewise, in rats exposed orally to increasing doses of Roundup, this author observed mild to severe fibrosis. Cardiovascular effects, digestive effects, carcinogenic effects, cytokine production, effects on the immune system, complement lymphocytes, phagocytosis, we've talked about those, genotoxicity, oxidative stress. There's a lot here, guys. What doses are needed to create those effects remains questionable, but that certainly raised my eyebrows. And that's why I find it interesting. I mean, this is a study that was published in, interestingly, in 2000. So this is a paper that was published 22 years ago. The conclusions of the authors were that under present and expected conditions of use, Roundup herbicide does not pose a health risk to humans. They talk about glyphosate. They talk about its breakdown product called AMPA, and they talk about the adjuvant found in Roundup, POEA, as well. Margins of exposure for chronic risk were calculated for each compound by dividing the lowest applicable NOAEL by worst case estimates of chronic exposure. Acute risks were assessed by comparison of oral lethal dose 50 values to estimated maximum acute human exposure. And they say, no problem. I'm curious, maybe I'm just cynical, but I would like to look at these authors and if they had any conflicts of interest. Based on what's happened in the subsequent 22 years, I wonder if these authors would reevaluate. But it's important to note that in 2000, there were multiple papers written that said glyphosate is fine for humans, no problems at all. I think that there is a significant amount of evidence now to suggest that probably not a great thing to have massive amounts of in your diet at all, and probably want to get checked for levels, which I'll show you in a moment. Moving on, the oral and intratracheal toxicities of Roundup and its components to rats. Just another specific study showing that both POEA, which is the adjuvant in Roundup, and glyphosate cause lung hemorrhage and lung epithelial cell damage with PO, which is by the mouth, or intratracheal through the lungs, through the windpipe exposures. These results indicate POEA and preparations that contain POEA were more toxic than glyphosate. This is one of the first things I showed you guys. The idea that glyphosate plus adjuvants in Roundup is probably worse than just glyphosate. Another study, comparative effects of the formulations of glyphosate surfactant herbicides on hemodynamics in swine, that is pigs. We conclude that both POEA and IPAG, which is a salt of glyphosate, infusion affected the hemodynamics of pigs and resulted in death in piglets, whereas a glyphosate sodium hydroxide base had no similar effects. So this is quite interesting that a glyphosate with sodium hydroxide base had no similar effects. But when the glyphosate was combined with POEA, as it is in Roundup, or this glyphosate salt, the IPAG, as will be found in other preparations of glyphosate, these GBHs, glyphosate-based herbicides, there were significantly worse effects on the hemodynamics of swine. Scary stuff. This one really caught my attention. The transcriptome profile analysis reflects rat liver and kidney damage following chronic ultra-low-dose Roundup exposure. Many of the studies I have shown you previously looking at animal models were using 25 to 500 milligrams per kilogram. This one is administering a 2-year study in rats at 0.1 parts per billion, which is 50 nanograms per liter glyphosate equivalent. That is an equivalent intake of 4 nanograms per kilogram body weight versus 25 to 500 milligrams in previous studies. So this is a very low dose glyphosate exposure. I think you could certainly achieve doses on par with this in humans. The results suggested that chronic exposure to a GBH, glyphosate-based herbicide, in an established laboratory animal toxicity model system in an ultra-low environmental dose can result in liver and kidney damage with potential significant health implications for animals and even human populations. That is an interesting one. That is a very low dose for, granted, the majority of those animals' lives, but that dose or the equivalent dose of that in humans could certainly be achieved without too many problems. So the EPA says that glyphosate is not an endocrine disruptor, and you can find that in all of the EPA's work. But then there are studies like this one from 2013 showing that glyphosate induces human breast cancer cells growth via estrogen receptors. Well, that doesn't sound good. This is glyphosate at 10 to the minus 12 or 10 to the minus 6 molar promoted the growth of T47D cells via estrogen receptors. It produced alteration of estrogen receptors, which can be blocked. Glyphosate altered estrogen receptors by increasing the expression ratio of estrogen receptor alpha and estrogen receptor beta. It changed the ratio of the receptors. And I'm excited to talk about this one. Glyphosate had an additive effect with Genistein. What is Genistein? I'll tell you in a moment. On estrogen receptor activation. And I'm excited to talk about this one. Glyphosate had an additive effect with Genistein on estrogen response element transcription, activation, and cell growth. What is Genistein? Genistein is a polyphenol found in soy and beans. And I recently came across a very interesting article talking about problems with Genistein in humans. Check this out. Yet another reason you probably don't want to be eating soy or beans, guys, but glyphosate in connection with Genistein had worsening effects on the estrogen responsive elements in the genome. These are elements within the DNA that become transcribed that turn into estrogen receptors. This is the DNA before it becomes the protein. But look at this study. Genistein lowers the fertility with pronounced effects in males. What will the soy boys say now? Meta-analysis on preclinical studies from the 27th of June, 2022. Genistein is an isoflavonoid found in a plethora of plant-based foods. That's why I don't eat them, guys. These meta-analyses show that Genistein has detrimental effects on male reproductive system and on the progression and sustenance of pregnancy, with more pronounced adverse impact in males, particularly when exposed in utero. Guys, you hope your mom didn't eat a lot of soy or tofu when you were in the uterus. Probably bad for women as well, but Genistein is also found in things like beans and peanuts. There's a little bit in beer. The biggest doses are in all beans, black beans, white beans, etc., and soybeans. You avoid those, you're going to avoid Genistein. This is what I talk about with my work. The fact that there are polyphenols in these plant foods that can have negative effects in humans. If you go to the internet, if you go to the interwebs, you can certainly find benefits of Genistein. But will you be alerted to the fact that there are side effects to these molecules that may not be great for humans? And I would continue to argue that I do not think that there is sufficient literature to suggest that we get any benefits from these polyphenols like Genistein and things like beans and soy that you can't get other places with less detrimental side effects. Eating soy does actually really appear to be detrimental from a hormonal perspective for both men and women, but at least in this study, especially on men. I'll show one more epidemiology study with glyphosate and then move on to talking about other pesticides in relation to my favorite topic, not favorite topic, kale. This paper, non-Hodgkin lymphoma and occupational exposure to agricultural pesticide chemical groups, active ingredients, systemic review, meta-analysis. They say, despite compelling evidence that NHL, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, is associated with certain chemicals, this review indicates the need for investigations of a larger variety of pesticides in more geographic areas, especially in low and middle income countries. So you can see here that there were associations between pesticides and NHL, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma subtypes were reported. B-cell lymphoma was positively associated with phenoxy herbicides and the organophosphorus herbicide glyphosate. Not all studies have showed this, but some epidemiology does show this. And this is, again, I think part of the things that led into the IARC's conclusion to classify glyphosate, I almost said kale, as a class 2 carcinogen. I don't think kale is a class 2 carcinogen, but I'm not a fan of kale in any way, shape, or form. So that's the summary on glyphosate. It's problematic. It's worse in connection with its adjuvants like POEA. There's definitely mounting evidence that it's harmful for humans. In animal models, there are very low dose chronic studies that suggest that it's quite harmful. It's in all the foods your kids eat. It's in a lot of the foods you used to eat as a kid. It's in Cheerios, it's in grains, it's on plants, it's on vegetables. It's a problem. I think we should avoid it as much as possible. Before I move on to talking about kale, I wanted to show you a link to how you can get your glyphosate level checked. I have no affiliation with Great Plains, but you can get a glyphosate level checked from Great Plains Laboratory. This page is quite informative. If you work with a provider, you can have them order a glyphosate level. It might be something to track longitudinally. In fact, the next time I go back to the States, I'm going to get my glyphosate level checked. I will share it with you guys, and then I will get the glyphosate level checked every time I go back to the States, and we can see where my glyphosate levels go. I can't always get my food 100% organic here in Costa Rica, and I need to check with the grass-fed farm that I get my meat from to see if they're fed grass that could be sprayed with glyphosate. But it's a really interesting thing to follow for most of us. Okay, on to kale bashing. This is one of my favorite things because who doesn't love a little good confirmation bias? No, but honestly, I try not to be biased in this way. I just find it interesting when mainstream reporting here at Insider Magazine from 2019 says, kale might be bad for you in some cases. Here's when you should be careful about eating it. How about all the time, Insider Magazine? But this just looks gross to me. I would never put my hands in a bucket of kale like that. Kale is packed with full of things that are good for you, like protein. That's a joke. Vitamin A, that's pretty much a joke. Why would you get beta carotene from kale when you can get it from liver or egg yolks? And vitamin K, well, kale only has vitamin K1, and we know that vitamin K2 is critical for humans as well. Vitamin K1 has no effects on cardiovascular risk in things like the Rotterdam study, but most people in the popular press and most vegans can't understand that vitamin K1 and K2 are different things. Neither could the doctors on that show when I went on there. They kept yelling at me, you can't get vitamin K in animal foods. And I was just like scratching my head. What are you actually freaking talking about? Insider says, but if you have an underactive thyroid, it might be a good idea to not eat too much of it. No shit. This is what I've talked about so many times. The isothiocyanates in kale can affect iodine uptake at the level of the thyroid. I think these are harming our thyroids, and there's no reason to eat kale. Certain compounds in the vegetables can interfere with thyroid hormone synthesis and essentially block the iodine. Yeah, I've talked about that. You probably would have to eat an excessive amount for this to happen, though. Well, I mean, when I was a vegan, I ate 2 heads of kale a day. I'm pretty sure I was nuking my thyroid. And as I've shown in previous podcasts, there are studies that suggest that goitrin is another isothiocyanate found in things like Brussels sprouts or chard, and in levels that most people consume in one salad or easily on a daily basis, they can affect radioactive iodine uptake at the level of the thyroid. This one is great. Kale also lists highly in the US for being contaminated with pesticides, so you should wash it thoroughly before eating it raw. Well, the main pesticide that kale is contaminated with is called dacthal. Kale is now one of the most pesticide-contaminated vegetables in 2019. And if you think you can get organic kale and get out of this, I have news for you. Stay tuned in this podcast. Kale samples contain traces of a weed killer named dacthal. And DCPA, or dacthal, is actually acknowledged by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States, to have negative endocrine disrupting effects on the thyroid. The EPA says glyphosate is totally fine, but dacthal does affect the thyroid negatively. So if you're getting non-organic kale, you're getting a double whammy to your thyroid. Lest you think you can avoid this by getting organic kale, stay tuned for what's coming next. So the list of reasons you don't want to eat kale and leafy greens grows. This is from the highly reputable source, Delish. Obviously, I'm joking, in 2018, but they did report that people are getting seriously sick from eating kale. It wasn't from the dacthal. It was from the thallium. This is a really interesting study. This is a really interesting story. I want to try and get Ernie Hubbard on the podcast. And if you look at these articles from Craftsmanship Quarterly, which is the best storytelling I can find about this vegetable detective, this is fascinating. Ernie Hubbard is a practitioner who worked in Marin County. And what he began to see in his clinic, the Preventive Medical Center of Marin, was that a number of people in this growing health trend over the last 12 years, 2010, were having problems, non-specific symptoms, chronic fatigue, issues like that. And they were eating a lot of kale. And eventually he connected the dots and began to realize that, yes, leafy greens like kale. Obviously, I skipped over a ton of the story in between there, guys. You can read the whole thing if you want here on the article. But he realized that many of these leafy greens do, in fact, take up heavy metals from the soil. We've known this for a long time, and kale is one of the worst offenders here. Many samples of kale have massive levels of thallium in them, a metal that is essentially toxic for humans. I think that much of this is based on this paper from Czech Republic, the uptake of thallium from naturally contaminated soils into vegetables. So yet another reason you may not want to be eating vegetables unless you know what the quality of your soil is. I would just not eat vegetables in general. But thallium transfer from naturally contaminated soils into vegetables was studied. They used multiple types of topsoils. What they found was that the uptake of thallium from soils with naturally high phytogeochemical content of this element can be high enough to seriously endanger the food chain. These findings are very important because of the high toxicity of thallium, the absence of threshold limits for thallium in soils, agricultural products, feedstuffs, or foodstuffs in most countries, including the Czech Republic. So yes, no one is testing for thallium levels in kale. That thallium, that kale, especially lacinato, which used to be my favorite kale when I was a vegan, the dino kale, appears to have the most thallium in it. According to the studies that Ernie Hubbard did in connection with doctors' data. I also want to get David Quigg on the podcast, who is the Chief Science Officer at Doctors Data. But the appearance of thallium in vegetables is commonly noted, with most of these leafy greens taking up heavy metals from the soil. It figures that we shouldn't really be eating leaves of plants. And I don't know why we are so obsessed with this, but thallium is just another reason not to eat leafy greens, especially not to eat kale. So hopefully I will get Ernie on the podcast and we can talk about the whole story of his interesting exploration with his patients. But he did a number of studies with doctors' data. He did a number of studies with his patients and found that the kale was contaminated. They had high levels of thallium. When they got rid of that, they did much better in their lives. It's a fascinating thing. Certainly there's been much pushback there because people don't believe this is true. But I don't think anyone has been able to discredit the soundness of the measurements at doctor's data of the kale or of the patients or the clinical findings that this practitioner has found. So why would you not want to eat kale? Why is kale bullshit? Isothiocyanates, which we talked about in the past, pesticides like Dacthal, which definitely are going to affect the thyroid. Even the EPA admits it. Thallium, the list goes on and on. Don't eat leafy greens, especially kale, but spinach is bullshit too because of the oxalates in there. When I was at White Oak Pastures 2 or 3 years ago for White Oak Cella, which is essentially the equivalent of our animal-based gathering, but we did it at White Oak Pastures before we knew the animal-based gathering was going to be a thing. One of the guys came up to the podium and said that he had recently detoxified, had a whole detoxification protocol from thallium. And I said, where did you get the thallium? And he said, kale. Oh yeah, of course. So I have met people, anecdotally at least, who had toxicity from eating too much kale. I would have to go back and look at the first times that I did provoked urine tests on myself. But I certainly ate a lot of kale in my vegan days, and I wonder what my thallium levels were historically. Like I said, I will do glyphosate levels in the future. With regard to the story of Ernie Hubbard and kale and thallium, there's a follow-up article in the Craftsman called The Vegetable Detective Part 2. You can see here they say the first question involved the quality of Hubbard's science. Perhaps the simplest answer to this question was delivered by Joshua Nachman, a nutritionist at JHU at Johns Hopkins University, Integrative Medicine Digestive Center. Nachman had occasion to quiz Hubbard about his work in response to a query from the Huffington Post. After several exchanges, Nachman came to the following conclusion. What he has found is good science. Nachman told me it's preliminary, not yet ready to be extrapolated to the population at large, but the chemistry is chemistry. It's all factual. So that's the most that I could find. I want to follow up on the story on Ernie Hubbard and thallium and kale. But if you eat a lot of kale or you have eaten a lot of kale, you might want to get your thallium levels checked. You can do that through doctor's data, work with a functional medicine practitioner, or just any practitioner that thinks holistically. Get your glyphosate levels checked. But in summary for this podcast, let's just wrap it up. Glyphosate doesn't look to me to be good for humans. I would be aware of how much is in your food. You probably want to get a baseline level and try and lower that. I think you want to buy organic food as much as you possibly can. Why are you feeding your kids Cheerios? Just give them meat and organs. Give them some hard and soil supplements. Give them some desiccated organs. Give them some fresh organs. And be aware that non-organic leafy greens are going to have other pesticides. There are many pesticides beyond glyphosate. There's 2,4-D, there's Dacthal, there's so many. There's paraquat. We talked about all of these. They're additive. Single studies with glyphosate are probably not telling us the whole story. Pesticides are probably not great for humans. I don't think this is fear mongering. That's not my intention. I'm not afraid of everything. I'm giving you the knowledge to move in your own life in a powerful way. Take control of your life. I sound like freaking Tony Robbins, but you get the idea. Live intentionally, or you will end up like so many other people, chronically ill without a path to an optimal life. And that's not what I want for you. So get meat, get organs, either fresh or desiccated, like we make at Hardened Soil. When this podcast comes out, we'll be at the end of August. There's probably still time to join us for Animal Base 30. And you guys should know that we are doing an animal-based gathering here in Costa Rica in April of 2023. You can go to animalbasedgathering.com to sign up for that. You can go to abnrf.org. That's the nonprofit that we've built, the Animal-Based Nutrition Research Foundation, to donate to our efforts. We're trying to get a study going with Stefan Van Vliet and start undoing all this madness in the nutritional science sector. I don't know how to even call it, the nutritional science craziness world. But avoid glyphosate, avoid other pesticides, don't eat kale, even organic kale, which is the last thing that I wanted to say, and I forgot to say it. Organic kale was higher in thallium than the non-organic samples. So if you think you're getting better with organic kale, you may be getting extra thallium. Nobody knows why, perhaps because it's extra sulfur in the organic kale and that's holding on to the thallium. But organic kale samples, at least in what was tested by Ernie Hubbard and Doctors Data, had higher levels of thallium. So you're not going to escape it with organic vegetables. Vegetables are the part of the plant that it wants you to eat. Not at all. It's the most toxic part of the plant. This is not debatable. It's full of defense chemicals. The only debate is whether those defense chemicals are harmful to humans and how well we can detoxify them. I would say there's plenty of evidence they're harmful to humans. This isothiocyanates, the thyroid, goitrogen, goitrin, so many other examples of this that I've enumerated multiple times in the past. I think a lot of us are very bad at detoxifying them. And I think a lot of human health problems, not all of them, but a lot of them are perhaps under the radar because they are being caused by vegetables. So the intention of the abnrf.org, the Animal-Based Nutrition Research Foundation, is to actually test this hypothesis with some science. So we're going to do that with Stefan Van Vliet at the university, at Utah State University, and do some randomized controlled trials looking at actual interventions with an animal-based diet, probably putting that up against a plant-based diet that even the most staunch vegans would be proud of, and using the ADA diet as a third arm, the American Diabetes, or an AHA diet, the American Heart Association diet, as a third arm, and looking at it in terms of outcomes for autoimmune conditions. That's our plan. Again, you can go to abnrf.org to donate, or join us for the animal-based gathering in Costa Rica. It's in April of 2023, and it's going to be amazing. It's just a great gathering of people. All right, you guys. So we have talked a lot about glyphosate. We've talked a little bit about PFAS, perfluoroalkylated substances. We've talked about thallium and kale. And I didn't want to end this podcast without talking about what you can do to remove these or decrease these in your life. I want to give you guys some actionable steps to move forward to decrease your glyphosate. I think the first thing that you can do is get your glyphosate level checked. You can go to Great Plains Labs, work with a doctor who is savvy, and they can order a glyphosate level. Use that as a baseline to start from. I haven't done that, interestingly, but I will do that in the future. Incidentally, I did talk to the grass-fed operation here in Costa Rica, and they said that all of their grass is fresh. They never feed hay, so I don't have to worry about any hay sprayed with glyphosate in the meat that I'm eating. And they said that they never use herbicides on the property or have not in the last few years. And they're going to test their meat for glyphosate. So that was really a cool conversation for me with the folks here in Costa Rica who are called Grass-Fed Costa Rica. If you visit Costa Rica, give them some support. No affiliation in the podcast. But I would recommend that you do that with wherever you are getting your meat from. Know where you are getting your fruit from. If you're eating vegetables, which is something I wouldn't recommend, you should get those organic. Get organic fruit as much as you can, and organic vegetables if you choose to. Make your own choice, and then think about your water. I've done previous episodes about water and why I think it's important to select your water carefully. Reverse osmosis is probably the best way to ensure glyphosate-free water. Your water could certainly be contaminated with glyphosate. Obviously, avoid grains, avoid the processed foods that I talked about in this podcast, Quaker oats, anything made with oats, wheat. All of those grains are going to have glyphosate. Incidentally, I think you should also avoid beans and soy to avoid genistein, which we know from that one study appears to worsen the estrogenic effects of glyphosate in animal models and potentially in humans. So avoid genistein, avoid beans, avoid tofu, get your water as reverse osmosis, and then think about other sources that might be contaminants for you in your life. So then you can repeat your glyphosate level and see how all of that is affecting you in your life. And then if their glyphosate level is correlated in any way, shape, or form. Further down the rabbit hole, there is another test from Great Plains Lab that you can do to look at all of the toxins that will look at multiple pesticides, multiple environmental contaminants. That's called GPL Tox. I have no affiliation with them in this podcast. I just think that they do a good job with this testing. Hopefully your savvy medical provider will be able to order one or both of those if you have concerns about toxic environmental exposure. So I think if you do those things, if you avoid glyphosate in your water by doing reverse osmosis, and you better know that your water doesn't have glyphosate by doing reverse osmosis, or checking with the filtered water company that you use, or checking with the spring water company you use, doing grass-fed, grass-finished meat, check with the provider, see how much glyphosate is in that meat. If they feed hay, any exposures you could have there. Vegetables, don't eat them. Fruit, avoid it. Beans, tofu, don't eat those. Or do, it's up to you, but I would advise against it. And then avoid the grains as well. And I think you will significantly lower your glyphosate exposures. By avoiding kale in general, you won't have exposure to thallium. You'll also have a lower exposure to these heavy metals like thallium that appear to possibly accumulate in these leafy greens. And I think that'll be a good thing as well. You'll also avoid Dacthal if you're not getting organic kale. I talked about that in the podcast as well. So your food choices, your water choices, your environmental choices, where you live, all of this will affect your glyphosate exposure. And I wanted to give you guys those actionable steps to move in the right direction. But hopefully this podcast on glyphosate helps give you some sort of science backing for the claims that this is probably not something you want to be drinking, be exposed to, expose your kids to, feed your kids cereals or granola bars that could have this in there. I think this is a really problematic thing for humans, and we'll begin to learn more of it in the future. I hope that Monsanto, who makes RoundUp and glyphosate, will not find a way to bury this research in the future. So hopefully that's helpful, guys. Love you all. See you next time.